What if three ordinary-looking Kennedy half-dollar coins could secretly be worth tens of thousands of dollars? In this episode, we uncover the jaw-dropping stories behind the 1973, 1979, and 1982 Kennedy half-dollar coins, each hiding rare errors and mysterious twists that stunned collectors and historians alike. These aren't just coins, they're accidental masterpieces. Let's start from the one that began it all, the 1973 JF Kennedy half-dollar coin. The 1973 Kennedy half-dollar was never intended to carry anything more than the legacy of a fallen president. Minted in Philadelphia and Denver, it marked the continuation of a series that had begun in tragedy a decade earlier. Its design was familiar, the solemn, confident profile of President John F. Kennedy on the obverse, the presidential seal on the reverse. There were no radical design changes that year, no planned variations, and no commemorative editions. It was supposed to be just another year in the long line of Kennedy halves. But something happened, something subtle, something undocumented, something that would, decades later, connect this coin to a woman who had nothing to do with its design, and everything to do with its meaning. In early 2023, a coin surfaced in a small estate sale in New Orleans. It had been kept in a wooden box, tucked between old letters and keepsakes. The box had belonged to a retired librarian named Miriam, who had lived a quiet life of books, lectures, and poetry. Among her possessions was a 1973 Kennedy half-dollar, encased in a simple plastic flip, with a handwritten note that read, "Angelou coin, special error, value?" At first glance, the coin looked like any other. But when a young collector named Brian examined it more closely, the anomalies began to speak. The obverse looked normal, Kennedy's profile sharp, the inscriptions crisp. But the reverse held secrets. The presidential seal, typically centered and bold, was skewed ever so slightly, its wings off-axis, its shield uneven. Around the rim, United States of America had ghosting behind the letters, almost like a whisper following a shout. And in the lower left quadrant, barely visible to the naked eye, there appeared a faint overlay of letters, fragmented, partial, and impossible to attribute to the coin's intended design. Under magnification, they became clearer, a loop, a vertical bar, and a faint serif. They weren't part of the presidential seal. They didn't belong there at all. Brian was confused. He submitted the coin to a grading service. The results were astonishing. It had been struck on a defective planchet using a misaligned die, and there were traces of a brockage, residual impressions from another coin that had been pressed against the die at the time of strike. But what made the error truly unique was that the underlying markings were not from another half-dollar. The ghost lettering appeared to match the serif and style of the font used on a commemorative medal produced privately in 1973 to honor Maya Angelou's early literary achievements. Somehow, by fluke or fault, a die or feeder mechanism had introduced remnants of an entirely different piece of metal into the minting process. Theories emerged. One suggested that leftover material from a privately struck Angelou medallion had been mistakenly processed into a batch of planchets at the Philadelphia Mint. Another speculated that the coin had been struck with a foreign object lodged between the die and the planchet. Regardless, the result was a 1973 Kennedy half-dollar with the faint fingerprint of a cultural icon who would not even appear on U.S. coinage for another 49 years. As the numismatic community got wind of the discovery, debates broke out. Could it really be connected to Angelou? Was it simply a flawed strike with coincidental markings? Experts were divided. But metallurgical analysis confirmed that the anomalies weren't random. The layering was precise, the impressions too clear to dismiss as wear or damage. A historian found that in 1973, a limited run of bronze commemorative medals had been minted independently in New York in honor of Angelou's groundbreaking work. One shipment of those blanks had been incorrectly sourced through a subcontractor also tied to the U.S. Mint. The overlap wasn't proven, but it was enough to draw attention. Brian was offered $50,000 for the coin at a private convention in Illinois. He declined. He said the coin didn't just represent an error, it represented a moment of unintentional tribute. A time when two legacies brushed against each other through accident or fate. Kennedy, the voice of change. Angelou, the voice of truth. Bound in metal, unintentionally intertwined. Then came the twist. A second coin appeared, this time in Oregon. Another 1973 Kennedy half-dollar, same misalignment, same planchet error, same faint markings. But this one bore an even clearer impression, a curved letter M beneath the eagle's left wing. It was enough to confirm that the first wasn't a one-off. There had been a small batch, likely no more than a few dozen, struck during a brief mechanical hiccup when foreign blanks contaminated a production line. The mint offered no official acknowledgement, citing standard policy on errors not recognized as intentional or commemorative. But privately, insiders hinted that the 1973 error run had been discussed in QA meetings years ago and then buried under standard procedural clearance. Collectors, now certain of the coin's origin, dubbed it the Angelou ghost error. The name stuck. Auctions followed. One error coin, nearly mint state, sold for $67,000 to a private investor in Boston. Another, slightly worn but with a sharp underlying impression, was purchased for $88,000 by a literary foundation in California, who displayed it under a glass case with a quote from Angelou, "Everything in the universe has a rhythm, everything dances." The coin became an artifact of that rhythm, an accidental dance between poetry and policy, literature and legacy. As time passed, the number of known examples stabilized at just under 10. Some had stronger impressions. Others were more subtle. But all of them had the same ingredients: 1973 Kennedy half-dollar, misaligned die, defective planchet, and faint, unmistakable shadow lettering. They became part of a new category of collectible, cultural errors. Coins not defined merely by mechanical fault, but by the improbable collision of historical figures and materials. What began as a quiet coin in a wooden box grew into one of the most unexpected numismatic stories of the decade, and today, for those few 1973 Kennedy half-dollar coins bearing the mysterious Angelou ghost error, the value stands firmly between $25,000 and $175,000, depending on the strength of the impressions, the clarity of the planchet anomaly, and the provenance attached to each piece. A forgotten relic reborn through error, speaking volumes without saying a word. The 1979 Kennedy half-dollar was struck in a year when the world was moving fast, economies shifting, nations redefining their place on the global stage, and technology beginning its quiet, unstoppable rise. The coin itself remained unchanged in design. President John F. Kennedy's resilient profile faced left on the obverse, while the reverse carried the stately presidential seal. For most people, this coin was a passing object, used in vending machines, stacked in bank rolls, and stored in pocket change trays across America. It was ordinary, mass-produced, and unremarkable to the untrained eye. But deep within that year's minting process, a strange mistake found its way onto a few coins, an error so obscure that it would take more than 4 decades to recognize its improbable connection to someone who, at the time, was still carving her place into American history. Maya Angelou. It all started in a coin dealer's booth in Sacramento in 2023. A teenager named Elise had inherited a small bag of coins from her grandfather, a lifelong reader and occasional coin collector who often said that both coins and words could outlive time if preserved properly. Most of the coins were predictable: state quarters, old wheat cents, a few silver dimes, but tucked at the bottom was a 1979 Kennedy half-dollar unlike anything the dealer had seen before. Elise had no idea it was unusual until the dealer paused mid-sentence, adjusted his magnifier, and turned the coin slowly in the light. The reverse bore the standard presidential seal, but something was off. The feathers in the eagle's wings looked smudged, like they had been doubled, then pulled. The olive branch below the eagle's talon had an extra leaf, clearly not part of the original design. Above it, where E pluribus unum should have been evenly spaced, the letters bled into each other. And when the coin was tilted just right, strange markings shimmered across the field: half letters, vague forms, and what looked like a delicate scrollwork etched behind the intended strike. The dealer was skeptical at first, thinking it might be post-mint damage or some sort of chemical reaction. But a quick weight check revealed the coin was slightly light, 5.1 grams instead of the standard 11.34. It had clearly been struck on the wrong planchet. Further inspection revealed a partial blockage on the obverse, where Kennedy's hairline appeared to collapse slightly, like another image had intruded just before the strike. This wasn't damage from circulation. This was something else. The coin was submitted to a grading service, where it stunned the examiners. The planchet had come from a defective metal source, lighter than a half-dollar, possibly intended for a foreign coin. The die alignment was slightly off, creating a shadow effect. But it was the markings across the reverse that raised eyebrows. An analyst traced the partial overlay back to a design element used in a privately minted token from 1979, one that had been made in limited quantity to commemorate the publication of Maya Angelou's acclaimed autobiography, And Still I Rise. How a private metal's design, or at least its residual impression, found its way onto a Kennedy half-dollar struck in a federal mint became the center of intense speculation. Coin historians dug into old production contracts and found that in the late 1970s, a third-party planchet provider had occasionally worked with both the U.S. Mint and private minting houses. There were gaps in quality control, especially during high-demand years. It was entirely possible, even plausible, that a blank intended for a commemorative token had been mistakenly fed into the press at the Denver Mint during a Kennedy half-dollar run. The overlay wasn't clean. It wasn't supposed to be. But there it was, faint curves resembling the letter A and the end stroke of a serifed Y, embedded subtly near the eagle's left wing. One numismatist even suggested that the orientation of the ghost image matched the flourish of Angelou's own signature, as it had appeared on early promotional literature. No official confirmation ever surfaced. But the evidence grew undeniable that something rare, unplanned, and almost poetic had occurred. This wasn't just a mechanical failure, it was a historical overlap. A moment where the legacy of a president and the voice of a poet became fused, if only accidentally, in copper-nickel alloy. The coin didn't shout its uniqueness. It whispered. But to those who heard it, the signal was unmistakable. Within a year of its discovery, the coin drew the attention of high-end collectors. Elise, unaware of its true worth, was offered $9,000 in cash by a private buyer, but her dealer intervened, urging her to wait. The coin was listed at auction and fetched a staggering $32,000. Word spread. A second example emerged in Oregon, followed by a third in Georgia. Each bore a slightly different expression of the error, some with cleaner brockage, others with clearer ghost lettering. But all were tied to the same anomaly, a 1979 Kennedy half-dollar, struck on the wrong planchet, with misaligned dies and faint impressions from a private metal likely connected to Angelou's rising influence at the time. By 2025, the coins had been dubbed the Angelou Whisper errors. They were rare, beautiful in their imperfection, and culturally resonant in a way that few modern coins could claim. Collectors who typically focused on 19th-century rarities suddenly turned their gaze to these late 20th century anomalies. Even scholars took interest, literary historians noting the symbolic overlap between two American icons, both figures of transformation, bound by error into a shared legacy. No one at the U.S. Mint publicly acknowledged the mistake. Perhaps it was deemed too obscure, too minute, too unlikely to be real. But those who held one of these error coins knew the truth didn't need confirmation. It could be seen in the faint curves, the shifted weight, the misplaced echoes of a story told not with words, but with metal. As of now, the 1979 Kennedy half-dollar Angelou Whisper error coins are valued between $13,000 and $113,000 depending on the sharpness of the error, the clarity of the ghost imprint, and the coin's condition. They remain some of the most enigmatic finds in recent numismatic history, a mistake that speaks louder than design, a tribute forged by accident, and a lasting echo of two legacies converging in a single coin. The 1982 Kennedy half-dollar was never meant to make history. Minted in large quantities across both Philadelphia and Denver, it was simply a continuation of the coin series honoring a fallen president whose image had become a familiar fixture in American currency since 1964. There were no commemorative plans for that year, no special editions, no declared anniversaries. It was just another run of a trusted design, President John F. Kennedy's portrait on the obverse, the presidential seal on the reverse, and a copper-nickel clad composition that hadn't changed in years. But buried in that massive production was an anomaly so subtle, so quiet, it took 4 decades and a curious discovery to bring its strange truth into the light. It began in a quiet antiques barn in upstate Pennsylvania in the fall of 2023. An older woman named Lena had been sorting through her late husband's lifelong coin collection. He hadn't been a professional collector, just a quiet man with a fascination for American history and the occasional weekend hobby of visiting estate sales and auctions. Among the hundreds of coins he had stored in small plastic flips, one stood out, not because of what it displayed, but because of what it didn't. The 1982 Kennedy half-dollar in question had uneven edges, an odd toning near the lower rim, and an unusually soft relief on the obverse, especially around Kennedy's ear and the motto, "In God We Trust." The dealer she approached examined it briefly, but his pause was long enough to stir curiosity. He turned the coin under the light again and again. There was something off, not just in the way the image appeared, but in the very feel of the metal. It was slightly thinner, slightly lighter, and bore signs of having been struck on a planchet never meant for this coin. The reverse was even more curious. The normally sharp presidential seal seemed warped, like its wings had been folded inward. A cluster of faint, extra lines danced just above the eagle's head, and deeper examination revealed partial, ghost-like impressions circling the rim, out-of-place lettering that didn't belong to any standard Kennedy half-dollar. Lena submitted the coin for professional grading, and the results triggered a wave of intrigue within the numismatic community. The coin had been struck on a misfit planchet, likely a foreign blank, creating a lighter weight and thinner rim. But more fascinating was the brockage and misalignment that revealed a partial transfer of another design. Under high magnification, within the shadowy lines above the eagle's wings, a peculiar swirl and serifed script could be seen. Experts initially struggled to decipher the markings until one linguistics professor, who moonlighted as a token collector, noticed that the fragment bore striking similarity to an inscription found on a limited run of privately minted 1982 commemorative tokens dedicated to the work of Maya Angelou. At first, the connection felt like a stretch. Angelou's work wasn't federally recognized on U.S. coinage until decades later. But the overlapping evidence was hard to ignore. The ghosted text on the coin matched the style and spacing of the Angelou medallion's engraved title, particularly the trailing curve of the letter Y from her name. Metallurgical analysis suggested that during a brief period in the 1982 production run, a blank or die used for that private token might have contaminated the minting process, resulting in a Kennedy $50 accidentally overstruck with remnants of that design. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't planned. But the accident, if that's what it was, resulted in a rare hybrid, a coin that linked two American icons in a completely unforeseen way. Theories exploded across forums and collector circles. Some speculated that a third-party planchet supplier had mishandled blanks between commercial and government jobs, accidentally introducing non-standard metal into the U.S. Mint's supply chain. Others argued it might have been a fluke involving reused dies or a stuck planchet from a private strike, unintentionally pressed into Kennedy's likeness during a moment of production chaos. Regardless of how it happened, the result was a Kennedy $50 with unmistakable phantom text and imagery associated with Maya Angelou, embedded in its surface like an echo from another time. By spring of 2024, Lena's coin was being referred to as the Angelou Phantom within rare coin circles. A private buyer offered her $25,000 before it ever went to auction. She declined. As word spread, others came forward with similar errors, each slightly different, each bearing its own mystery. One had a stronger brockage on the obverse, another showed an even clearer swirl behind the eagle's head, almost mimicking the cursive script of Angelou's poetry titles. A third coin, found in San Diego, contained a visible fragment of an M near the rim, strikingly similar to the M found in Angelou's initials on several of her bookplates. Experts began cataloging them together as a subcategory of error, not just wrong planchet, not just brockage, but unintentional cultural hybrids. The coins represented more than mint mistakes. They told stories of overlapping legacies, of errors that carried meaning, of voices meeting in metal. No official explanation ever came from the U.S. Mint, and none was expected. These errors were rare, undocumented, likely buried in the chaos of high-volume production. But for collectors and historians alike, they became prized symbols of unlikely connection. Kennedy, who inspired a generation through politics and charisma. Angelou, who lifted voices through literature, truth, and unflinching grace. Together, they were never meant to meet on a coin, and yet, in a handful of flawed strikes, their legacies brushed against each other in an unexpected act of remembrance. Auction houses soon began recognizing the value. The first coin sold for $41,000 to a museum curation group interested in pairing it with rare books and cultural artifacts. A second fetched $63,000 at a private sale to a philanthropist who cited it as a coin that speaks louder than its denomination. And still, each new example brought variations, stronger impressions, different metal tones, slightly off-center strikes. No two were perfectly alike. As of today, only a small handful of these 1982 Kennedy $50 Angelou Phantom errors are confirmed. Their value, driven by condition, clarity of the overlay, and collector demand, now ranges between $15,500 and $133,000. What began as an overlooked relic in an attic box became a bridge between poetry and politics, between narrative and numismatics. A flawed coin that tells a perfect story.